so when I was a teenager, my sister and my father committed suicide, six years apart. And I think obviously the pain of losing them in that way was just so vast. But by far the worst thing about it was the lack of cultural capacity to have any kind of conversation about what had happened, sort of like on a small community basis, but also larger. And so for me, the most painful aspect of that grieving was the silence, like the deep, deep silence. And also, I think when people die that way, I mean, it's not true for everyone, but in my world it was, where because there was no way to approach talking about them, what had happened, like that they became people that had never lived, like. And that was just, it was like having this part of my life that was so impactful, you know, like obviously their lives were impactful, but their deaths were impactful. But having this huge part of my life just be like kind of unspeakable.
Welcome to Be Human, Jessie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Jessie, where I'd love to start with you is on the topic of desire. And what I would really love to know is, I know that you've had deep self-exploration on this concept. So I'd love for you to share what was kind of your original understanding of desire and how has it changed throughout your exploration?
I guess I see desire mostly as like a feeling of wanting. And so, you know, the way that I envisaged it in the beginning was that, you know, there's all sorts of areas of our lives where we want, you know, not, and so, you know, one of them is like around sex and sexual need. And, you know, but then I guess I think of it much more broadly than that, like a desire for understanding, a desire for connection, a desire to be heard, a desire to for touch, you know, like for so many things. So I mean, I started from that point, and where I came to, I guess I still feel, I don't feel like my book was one so much of like cathartic, you know, understanding. I think we all have to live with the fact that we desire, you know, and wanting and needing is part of the human experience. And we have to learn to cohabitate with it. I mean, you know, I know that there's all those kind of the Buddhist leaning towards non-attachment and all that sort of stuff, but I guess I'm not really like, I want to be, I as a human want to be living, and I think that wanting and needing are part of living. So I guess I see it on that kind of spectrum.
And I know that you explored even the idea of attachment quite deeply, particularly in relation to the desire for connection with other people. And in your book, you wrote, "I was longing to understand why falling in love was so psychologically difficult." Can you share more about what you've come to understand about that?
I think I mean, it might be kind of across the board, but I think for people that have experienced significant attachment trauma in their lives, especially as children, but not necessarily as children, even as adults, the process of falling in love just feels incredibly risky. And so, you know, because if attachment, like your ability to feel safe in attachment, is something that's been, you know, that's been troubled throughout your life, then the process of falling in love just for some of us feels incredibly unsafe. And so yeah, I just think that's a reality for a big proportion of the population, and we're kind of like culturally sort of sold this story that falling in love is incredible and beautiful and like, I don't know, what we all aim to do, incredibly fulfilling, like the epitome of human experience. But for a lot of us, it's a lot more fraught than that. It's a lot more difficult. It brings up all of our, darkest sort of, the darkest kind of areas or experiences we've had. Like, it's just like a state. I think for a lot of us, it's a state of kind of extreme being extremely triggered.
Yeah.
And that means that it, like, even, we all know, like falling in love is a series of really of highs and lows. I think that's probably true for everybody, but for people that have attachment trauma, I think that's just times 1,000. So
Yeah.
I feel like there's a direct correlation between those kind of difficulties, attachment sort of difficulties, and how it ends up being when you're an adult in love.
And you studied some of the greats, Bessel van der Kolk and Esther Perel. I know you've studied attachment theory quite deeply. What is it that's sort of helped you personally the most out of all that sort of self-research?
I think it was really big for me to feel that my behaviors were relatively normal. So like, it's normal if you've had difficulty with attachment as a child to feel anxious in your relationships. And it's normal to feel avoidant of certain things, like both of those. I mean, I tend to see anxious attachment and avoidant attachment as kind of like similar, just one side of a coin. They're just different adaptations to feeling insecurely attached or traumatized. And so, that research just made me feel less freaky, like more like my responses were pretty natural if you considered what I'd been through.
Yeah.
Whereas I tended to think of myself, and I still catch myself in this kind of thinking, but I tended to think of my body's responses to certain things as being really in conflict with my mind, or what I would even describe as myself. So I felt like I was always dealing with, I would describe it as a recalcitrant body, like a body that wasn't willing to come on board with what it was that I wanted to do. To see this really sort of quite big split. And for a long time, I was really confused about why my body would be sort of not helping. And I would kind of be like, body, help me, body. And so, I guess I've come to understand that my body's trying to help me. Like, that's what's happening. So we're not really in opposition the way that I thought that we were. Like, it's sometimes the way my body tries to help might be a bit maladaptive, but I think it is, it's on my side. That's probably my biggest issue.
I think it's such a powerful lesson to learn, and I think particularly for women, such a transformative one, because I certainly could relate to so many of the experiences that you shared in your story. And I think one of the biggest things is to stop resenting your body for being in that conflict, and to come to understand that the way in which it's reacting is doing its best to serve a purpose of protection for you. And it's about being able to be in a safe enough space to start sort of exploring and healing that, which certainly takes time, and the opportunity of safe spaces to be able to do that. A question that you posed in your book was, how do people with difficult histories like mine find ways to safely interact with other people? What have you found has helped you to feel safe around people?
I mean, I think one of the problems, and Bessel van der Kolk talks about this a lot, is, that if you have had that kind of disruption, then your capacity to tell who's safe, who's a safe person, is sometimes just sort of disrupted. So, I would probably start there. It's, finding being able to tell, like, you know, working on those kind of, I guess they would be called sort of discernment skills around you know, human beings who are actually safe spaces, you know. Yeah, so that, for me, that's probably number one. And, you know, it's tricky because it takes a while to get to know somebody. So, I mean,
It does.
You know, that's, yeah. I mean, Brene Brown has that concept of not floodlighting, is like making sure that the person that you're trying to share yourself with has, you know, that there's enough safety in that connection to make the sharing safe. So, you know, but that, all of that involves discernment. So
Yeah.
yeah.
To my understanding, sort of in more intimate experiences, there are times that you struggle to feel really present within those experiences. And again, I feel like this is certainly a common experience for many people. What have you found to be helpful for you to be able to sort of stay in the present and feel safe within your body?
I think there are a lot of movement practices that help with that. You know, even just something like dancing. You know, it's not anything that is, well, you know, moving you sort of from your head into your body helps. I guess it's, and also just, you know, not being too hard on yourself. Like I think there's that thing in my book where the first time that I'm engaging sexually with a new person and I can't stop my mind is just throwing up all sorts of kind of and I'm saying to myself, be present in my mind, but I'm not actually. But you know, like this embodiment and stuff, like that's a trauma response. It's pretty natural. And so, you know, I guess that's the other thing, is to, I think it's probably unlikely that the first time that I'm intimate with someone, I'm not going to be challenged with that kind of disembodiment, just the nature of the beast. So it's more like, it's like a double thing of like, whatever practices that you can find that help you be in your body and finding someone safe to be in your body with, you know, but then also just being like, this is a process. It's not going to happen straight away. I mean, safety is built, connection is built in relationships. So like, you know, just also being able to have a bit of a laugh about it.
Right.
For me,
yeah. Just humanizing it, right?
Yeah.
And I know a reflection of you, for you, is trying to understand how much of sort of this past experience, this trauma, plays into your present experience, and how much of this is actually just influenced by culture. Where have you sort of landed with that for you personally?
I do think it's a little bit of a of a unsolvable puzzle in a sense, because, you know, if you're having trouble, like trauma is defined as, you know, just in the normal dictionary as a startling experience with long-lasting effects. So you only really sort of come to the, well, I mean, not everybody, but for me, you know, I only started to sort of recognize that I had experienced trauma when I started to recognize that I was experiencing long-lasting effect, you know. So and for me that was around the body doing all sorts of strange things. Like I don't think I would have seen myself as a traumatized person unless I had that kind of experience in the present. And then, but if you're someone like me with a really complex history of like multiple things, you know, the way that I ended up thinking about it is just, you just sort of putting them all beside each other, and, you know, it's obviously it's a kind of a cumulative thing, but we don't tend to think about trauma that way. We tend to think about it as like a big event where there's a clear line from that big event to, you know, the lasting effect. So if you use something like a car accident, you know, it's obvious what that is. But if you've got, and, you know, for people with really complex trauma histories who've got, you know, just multiple daily kind of, you know, things, you can't make that clear line. And so I think it's just it is a puzzle. And in terms of the cultural stuff, I guess I found that really confusing because I looked around at my friends and acquaintances and realized that a lot of them had experienced, especially sexual, what would I call it? Low-grade sexual assault, and and when I was a teenager, those behaviors or those experiences were incredibly normal. Like we didn't think about them as being, we just thought about them as what happens to you. So I'm talking about things like, being felt up on a bus against your will, or being at a music festival and being touched inappropriately by someone you don't know, or being drunk and being coerced into sex you don't want. All of those things happened to all of my friends all of the time. And so, I began to be kind of a little bit, I suppose, confused why was my body showing with such aggressiveness this kind of trauma, when there might have been lots of people around me who might have experienced things that were, similar, but wasn't showing, their bodies weren't sort of behaving in this way. I just think it's all really hard to separate, and why one person would be really impacted by something and why another person would sort of breeze through it is just one of the mysteries of the nervous system for me. Yeah. But I think I know it's a sort of big statement, but I think that a large proportion of women come out the other end of their childhoods with some degree of sexual trauma, just from living in our culture. Yeah. And I think if you don't, then you're just really lucky. Yeah,
I definitely can relate to that. Certainly as I get older, there are memories that pop up from being young that I'm like, that's interesting. It didn't feel, intuitive, probably gut response, it did feel somewhat uncomfortable. But it's not sort of till you get older that you actually have, I guess, the maturity to reflect on what actually happened. And
I also think we're living in a time where the what's normal is changing really fast.
Yeah, that's true.
It was kind of horrifying to see that whole thing that came out with the private school boys and girls that were, about the kind of sexual sort of stresses or traumas that a lot of those girls were experiencing. Like, that's just happening now, and that in their culture obviously did feel relatively normalized, and it's only once you bring those things out into the light of day and everyone goes, oh God, that probably a lot of those teenagers thought, wow, like that's really uncool, but when I was a teenager, it's hard to know if it's gotten worse or better. I do sort of, how would we know? Because in a sense, all of those things are sort of underbelly behaviors, aren't they? But I do think that at least the cultural narrative around that stuff being normal versus not normal has changed quite quickly. Yeah. So, because when I was a teenager, if I complained about those sort of things to the people around me, they would just be like, boys will be boys. Like, that was just genuinely what people would have said. Whereas now they wouldn't say that. I don't think they'd say they shouldn't be doing that stuff, but
yeah. And it makes the experience even more complex, doesn't it? Because when you are older and times are changing, which influences your reflection on past experiences, you kind of like, well, what do I do with that? In understanding what that really reflects.
Yeah. And also in terms of, not that I have any desire to do this, but in terms of holding people to account for things that they've done historically, that when they did them seem normal in the culture they did them, but now seem really abnormal. All of that sort of stuff is all really tricky to deal with too, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. But I think it comes back to obviously what we can control in ourselves. And as you shared, like, people's nervous systems are different and they do react differently to similar situations. and it's about coming to understand and be more connected with your own body. And it even made me think, Jessie, about a year ago, I did this sort of exercise where I sort of shut all the curtains in my room, like made sure the door was like shut, and kind of tried to like feel into my body in the sense of sort of dancing and movement. And it was interesting how rigid I was. And it was like a really beautiful experience to kind of notice that like literally there's no one here but me, and there's still a sense of threat that is sort of within this space. And it was a really great opening to sort of start exploring why that was, and to, as you're suggesting, start just practicing moving into your body and dancing. And a lot of people would probably just write it off, but there is so much power in sort of reconnecting through something like that.
Oh, I think so. And you know, like the more that you can move away from, because I don't have a history of being, you know, but you know, I imagine that a lot of women, when they dance, have sort of like dancing is one area in which they're always aware of the way they look from the outside. You know, that's part of where, I mean, it's a woman's lot in a sense to have that double view, like of, you know, of I'm living inside my body, but I'm also viewing myself from the outside, because that's what we're told everyone's doing all the time. So I love the idea of dancing. I mean, obviously the cliche dance like no one's watching, but actually literally like, you know, like in the dark, like, you know,
Right.
that all of that stuff, and trying to imagine like and lean into the sort of what the feeling of what your body wants to do and the way it wants to move with no visual input at all. You know, I think those sort of things are really powerful. They sound simple, but I think they're really powerful ways to reclaim, you know, the internal experience of your own self. Like, I mean, that's my biggest thing, I think, is if we could all like live inside our bodies, looking out rather than looking at ourselves. Like it would just be so revolutionary. And yeah, I think that's one way to start.
It's beautiful. And you share in your story some pretty significant events in your life surrounding your experience with grief. And I only want to go as deep as sort of you're comfortable with. What has sort of helped you as someone that has experienced deep grief in different situations? What is sort of your understanding of grief, and what has helped you to move through it?
I think for me, the biggest thing, and it, you know, well, I'll just, so when I was a teenager, my sister and my father committed suicide, six years apart. And I think obviously the pain of losing them in that way was just so vast. But by far the worst thing about it was the lack of cultural capacity to have any kind of conversation about what had happened, sort of like on a small community basis, but also larger. And so for me, the most painful aspect of that grieving was the silence, like the deep, deep silence. And also, I think when people die that way, I mean, it's not true for everyone, but in my world it was, where because there was no way to approach talking about them, what had happened, like that they became people that had never lived, like, and that was just, it was like having this part of my life that was so impactful, you know, like obviously their lives were impactful, but their deaths were impactful. But having this huge part of my life just be like kind of unspeakable and unacknowledgeable. And for me, that was so painful. That was as painful as the loss. And so for me, there's just been just so much power in speaking, and in my case, writing, not speaking. And writing was just such an incredible space in the beginning, because I I suppose it was almost like it was a space where I could relearn how to talk to myself, how to talk. Um, I always describe it as like I felt like I was telling secrets. I was whispering secrets into my own ear, right? Like I had become so silent inside or so voiceless that I could only whisper to myself. Like, and I literally believed that there was no audience. There was nothing. There was just this quiet whisper, yeah, that only I could hear. And that was the writing page for me. That's what it felt like. And you know, the power of it was just immense. And that was before publication. That was before anything. So, and you know, with Staying, that the book that sort of that you know takes the reader on that journey, it was about 15 years from beginning to write to publication. So really long time. And then, you know, when it was published, I think I was really afraid that I would have the same experience, that I would publish this book that was too hard to talk about, that was too hard to engage with, and that it would be like another experience of being ignored or silenced. But it wasn't like that at all. It was really beautiful. It was like,
wow.
It was like, I mean, I think the way the book is written is very specific because I'm so aware that it's going to be a hard journey for people. So what I really wanted to do when I wrote that book is say, and I mean this tonally, or like I wanted the tone of the book to be like, this is going to be hard, but I've got you. Like, we're going to do this together. And almost like, I suppose, like what I wanted when that happened to me, to have that sort of feeling. Yeah. And so I think partly because the book was written that way, but anyway, it just like, it allowed a conversation, like public conversation, that I had never envisaged being part of or never envisaged being welcome into. And it was so beautiful. Like I was so afraid, and it was nothing, like none of my fears were realized in that sense. So that was beautiful too. But yeah, so yeah, I just think silence is really destructive and speaking is really powerful.
And in relation to that, because I totally get that experience, and I'm sorry that you experienced that on so many different levels, Jessie. How did you need people to support you in that? Are there specific words that you needed, or was it more just the acknowledgement and conversation?
Yeah, I never think of it as specific words. I'm really, really big on having a punt. Like, I was so, I know not everyone feels like this, so this is not for everyone, but for me, I was so, what's the word? When someone was brave and came and tried to speak to me about what had happened, even if they said something really ridiculous or really, like, I was still kind of overjoyed that they'd made that leap. I think it's one of the most courageous things to do, like, you know. And I literally remember every single person who called me, because I was 18 when my dad died, and we just finished school, so it was like all of my friends were really dispersed because everyone had gone off to uni and, you know, in different places and everything. But the people that called me from, you know, like lives that they could have just kept on with, and they could have not called. And then that, you know, people who called and had like the most awkward conversation of their life because I was, you know, like devastated and I didn't know how to help them help me. Like, I still feel so much gratitude for those awkward calls. You know, yeah, I'm a really big, like, I like to celebrate, you know, having a go even if you get it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think that every grieving person is so unique, and what they need is so unique, and you can't jump in and know that. I mean, obviously, like, first things first, you could ask them what they want from you. But I think a lot of grieving people don't even know. They don't know. There is so much pain, they don't know what they need. So I really think that, the effort is just everything for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's just that feeling of someone being there for you despite the challenge or
Yeah.
the pain or the suffering or the confrontation. I mean, obviously when people avoid, as you know, there's fear, and it's being, as you're suggesting, just being able to be courageous in that fear and just be there for
Yeah.
someone.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really hard. Like, I've been on the other end of that now so many times when I've had friends or family who've lost people, and I know how hard it is. It's so hard. Especially, like, the more pain someone's in, the harder it is, because you're facing something that's really challenging. But I just think to be brave, that's it.
Yeah. And as you've shared, you've written a book on your experience with grief, and now you've written a book on desire. What is something that you would like to share on what you've learned about yourself through the writing of those books?
I guess I mean, I tend to, I like the concept that we're always in a state of becoming, and so with both of those books, I mean, I think they're an interesting trajectory, because with Staying, the first book, which details the loss of my family members, I had become very muted, I think, as a person. I had become, that was the sort of outcome of that silence. And so that book, it sort of ends, in a sense, with just a glimpse of awakening to the possibility of more liveliness. Like, I almost felt like I was kind of covered in a my grief was like a sort of heavy blanket that I was having trouble kind of coming out from underneath. And at the end of that book, I mean, the book isn't all, because the book charts from my childhood onwards, so it's actually, there's a lot of joy in that book too. But at the end of it, it was like I was shrugging that big blanket off. And then with Desire, I really wanted to explore, I suppose, what it felt like to try and live in a more vibrant and awakened kind of state. And that was just, that's a natural, I suppose, progression, in terms of, it's a long time. Like, I just turned 45, and Staying sort of ended when I was about 27. So it's sort of like, it's that period of stepping into life, I guess, a bit more. And so I mean, I don't feel like, I guess I've learned that, I mean, I just think that we're all on a continuum of constant sort of evolving or becoming, and there's nothing sort of super definitive that I would say, except that, I've done a lot of things that I never thought that I would be able to do, and that includes, like, falling in love unwisely, and I don't know, talking about it. So like, I feel like these are sort of achievements I'm proud of, even though they are, not what might be considered ordinary successes.
And obviously, desire is a very present experience for all of us by virtue of being human. How have you come to separate things that we should go after and things that we should sort of let go of?
I think I would probably be quite instinctual about that sort of stuff. Like, I try to listen to what my body's telling me. And I also think, I mean, I think this comes up a bit in my book, but I think when we've been hurt, we tend to be really sort of like fixated the next time round on red flags and things like that, and things that we wouldn't tolerate, or and I'm not saying there's not value in that. Yeah, but I still think it's not like, I mean, I would have definitely done things differently in the relationship that I explore in that book if I had my time again, but I wouldn't have not wanted to have it. Like, I wouldn't have wanted to be like, oh, he doesn't do this, and this, red flag, so get out early. I don't know if I'm a proponent of that. Like, I still feel like the experience was really valid and really in life enhancing, and like,
Beautiful.
I don't regret it. I don't feel that way. So I would probably, I mean, for me to be motivated to explore, like, for example, a sexual relationship or an intimate relationship with somebody else, because it's so hard for me, like, because my body is troubled by it and it's psychologically difficult, as you said in that early quote. I really have to have a big sort of pull in that direction, a big magnetic pull. Otherwise, there's just no way that I would do it. So, like, I wouldn't. I'm perfectly happy to be single. I'm perfectly happy to be. I'm not looking for that. So it would really have to be something that was so, I was so curious to explore, that I was so sort of magnetically pulled towards. But, then there's the kind of the wisdom in, the sense that if that sort of magnetism is really high, then maybe it's a problem. Like, maybe it's a sign that there's some kind of like problem in terms of the attachment and stuff. Like, maybe that's a problem. But I still just kind of think I still want to explore it. I mean, I want to make myself safe, and I want to think about my safety, but I don't want to not live.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be so afraid, and I don't want to be so risk averse that I don't do anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. And I think, as you shared at the start, it just certainly plays into that, the gut instinct, and just sort of listening to that. And, despite that, a lot of us make decisions that aren't in line with that, but that's okay. It's the exploration, it's the experience. And as you suggested, if you can kind of approach it from sort of this life-enhancing way rather than this regrettable way, it's just a part of life.
Yeah, and I think there's a really, really big difference between dynamics that are outright abusive,
right?
Like, as in, like, I'm sure people learn stuff from being in abusive relationships too, but I think there's a big difference between that kind of dynamic and a dynamic which is just sort of not solid, or like, I mean, I would definitely be aiming to avoid an abusive or, sort of damaging dynamic in that sense. But I still would like to allow myself to explore uncertainty of all descriptions, like, for that to be acceptable.
Yeah, the unknown. Unknown is quite enticing. Well, thank you, Jessie, for this beautiful conversation. Thank you for being so raw and vulnerable. I really appreciate everything that you've shared, and your book is just absolutely beautiful. From the first word that is written, it really is a beautiful journey. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So on a final note, Jessie, I would love to ask you, what does it mean to you to be human?
I mean, I think that what I'm aiming for, I mean, to be human is to be alive, simply. But I want to step into that aliveness. So I want to be, I want to get more comfortable with being in feeling, with being in uncertainty, with being, vulnerable with, you know, with all of those things that, like being a human animal involved. I suppose I see being human as being all of those things, like a whole spectrum of things, rather than you know, a robot.
Yeah.
But you know, disembodiment, which is, I think we all in this culture probably don't even recognize how much we move in and out of this disembodiment and numbness and all of that sort of thing. And so I guess my aim would be to move away from those states and towards, you know, feeling. But that comes with a high degree of discomfort. So yeah. I think that's being human.